So, hello, listener, wherever you are out there. Welcome to Peter and Debra doing a podcast, the first one of 2025. And hello, my lovely friend, Peter Wanless. How was your Christmas and New Year break?
Yeah, it was great. Thanks, Twinny. I'm still on my break. I don't know whether to describe myself as unemployed or retired, but I finished up at the NSPCC before Christmas and have been on holiday ever since. And it still feels a little bit like an extended break. And at some point, I'm going to realise that I haven't got a full-time job, and I'll need to set about doing some other things. I've not been into London yet in 2025. Tomorrow, I'm going for the first time into town to do some training in relation to a particular piece of work that I've picked up, and maybe we could talk about a little bit more when I'm a bit clearer about quite what it involves. But it's exciting. So yeah, I had a very quiet and fun break, extended break, but I'm actually quite looking forward to getting involved in doing something in the very near future. How about you? I guess you're back at work and full steam ahead, and it feels like you've never been away.
Work, it's very full on. It's an incredibly busy January, for everybody at DSC, actually, because we ramping up all our programs in the year and stuff like that. No, I had quite a good break. It was quite busy, although, a terrible thing has happened to me and my partner, Andy, because we accidentally watched the first episodes of Traitors season 3. We've never watched it before, never been interested in it, but we accidentally watched it. It just happened to be on while something else. And honestly, it's the biggest mistake of our life. My partner is so involved in it. He shouts at the telly at the faithfuls for being stupid and stuff like that. I don't know about you, Peter. Are you a Traitors fan?
Oh, we love the Traitors. Yeah, we didn't watch the first season, but we watched the second last year, which was it's brilliant. I mean, it's really interesting insights into human nature, isn't it? And it's also really interesting insights into how you make television programs and how they manipulate you through what they choose to film and not film, and the narratives which develop. But no, I love it. So yeah, without giving too much away, what are your highlights so far, or what do you like about it?
I find absolutely fascinating about it is how easily manipulated people are. Now, I know they are, my degree is in psychology and I keep up with all that kind of stuff. And I'm very, into human behavior and human thinking and cognition and stuff like that. But it's just how it takes so little for everybody to jump on a bandwagon to become a herd. And I was thinking about how relevant that is to the workplace, for example. When somebody says something negative, it's so easy for folk to then all join in, and people stop using their their sort of their contrary evidence. They stop using their sensibleness and look for other things. You see that on the Traitors, but I think it's not that they're particularly awful, and of course it's edited, but it's not to say that they're awful. That's normal human behavior. That's what we do. And you've seen it yourself in meetings when there'll be one person saying, I'm not really sure that's such a great idea, or I don't really agree, and that person often gets shouted down or completely talked over because of the power of the group to gather people around. So I'm finding it not just good fun to watch, but also absolutely fascinating. I'm thinking how the hell do you prevent it? Like in real life, how do you stop yourself being sucked into, because we all sit there shouting at the telly thinking we wouldn't be such idiots. But I'm sure those people who entered the Traitors this time also watched the previous season and thought, well, I would never make mistakes like that, or I'm far too, whatever. And then we all end up just being human beings. So yeah, I'm finding it fascinating, absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, groupthink is definitely a thing, isn't it? And I've also learned as I became more senior in organizations that people thought I was wiser than I really was, because wisdom comes with authority. And I'm sure you find this as well, being in situations where you're wanting to contribute creatively to a debate, but if you're not careful, what your wild idea is taken as is an instruction, and before you know it, a team of people have gone away and implemented something that was just a suggestion. So there's the who's worth listening to and who there's no point in being a leader if you're not worth listening to, I guess. But at the same time, how you strike that balance between being clear and authoritative, but not
Yeah.
misleading or skewing that kind of creative debate is a challenge.
Such a good point. I remember years and years and years ago when I first came to DSC, when our designer used to design the covers for the books, they used to come and ask you, it wasn't just her, the marketing team used to come and ask me what I thought. So I'd tell them. And of course, I was very new to being a chief exec, and it never occurred to me, because then they would argue with me and they'd come back and they'd say, well, this is the reason why this is better than what other thing. And it wasn't until it took me ages to realize it's because they didn't think my opinion was just my opinion. They thought that they had to please me.
Yeah.
And in the end, it took me saying to them, listen, I don't know anything about this. I don't like that cover, but who cares? You're the ones who are designing it. It's your job. You're the experts. I'm happy to give you my opinion, but it's only that. You must make the decision that you think is best for the organisation. So in the end, they stopped asking me, which was probably the right thing to do, to be fair. And I think it's doubly true, Peter, because there's the job title, and also I have a very forceful, enthusiastic personality, and I get so excited about things that it's very easy for me to bulldoze over people, and quite hard for my team to challenge me. I have to work really hard to make the space to say things like, this isn't an instruction, I promise, this is just my input, or this is just a thought. But I know they probably take me far too seriously than they should, although it doesn't help that I constantly tell them that I do in fact know it all, and I am in fact very wise.
Something that I found very difficult, and I think the organisation found quite difficult at the NSPCC, was how to involve me in the positioning of major advertisements or public information films, because you can't have something which is as visible as that the chief executive isn't comfortable with or associated with. And being a previous director of communications, I feel like I've got some professional insight into these issues, although there is the hazard of, as we said earlier, the kind of authority and one person's opinion versus what the evidence and the audience, the target audience, are saying. But we had quite sophisticated sign-off processes. They're called the RASCI. I can't even remember what RASCI stands for as an acronym, but all sorts of people have to have their input into something which is a public statement of what the charity stands for, and the chief executive comes right at the end signing it off. But by the time you're ready to sign it off, actually no one is interested in what the chief executive thinks. In fact, if you have a thought or a suggestion, it's positively disruptive because there's no time to change. So finding a way of inserting yourself into the creative process in a collective conversation where you don't skew the debate, but also you have that kind of authority piece that commits the money with appropriate reference to target audiences and the real messages and purpose of what you're doing is it is tricky, and I think caused the number of times I've had that kind of conversation with people up and down the chain, and we've reminded ourselves of the different roles that that people can play without ending up in a sort of situation where you're in this kind of mess of nobody can do anything until everyone has agreed with it.
Yeah. Well, I must admit, I really feel that, because I tend to say to my team, please involve me at the beginning. Involve me at the beginning, get my input then, and then you just crack on. Because, the trouble is, because I'm bound to notice something. I'm bound to say, I don't think that's going to work. And that's so dispiriting for people when they get that at the very end of the process. So I say to them, get me at the beginning. If you want my views, get me at the beginning. But on the whole, at DSC, we try very hard to let the people. So we're very keen on consulting. So we always say to people, well, you can't anyway, to be honest, because we're so small at DSC, everybody has to do a bit of everything. But we do try to say to people, reach out to other people and get their views and opinions. But ultimately, we try and make sure that the person who makes the final decision, who's the person who's the expert in that field. So, for example, José, with our podcast series, José gets to make the decisions about those, what we do, what we don't do, how we do it. Other people might input, but it's down to him to say what works and what doesn't work. And similarly with what books we publish, that's decided by our publishing editor. Because I always say to people, I don't know. You know, I've got the overview. I can see the connections. I can tell you, you know, you must remember to
Yeah.
speak to XYZ person, but I don't do your jobs on a day-to-day basis. So I'm not the expert. So I'll give you my view. I've always got an opinion. I'm happy to share
Mm.
it, but it's not going to be my decision. And even when people email me to say, can I ask about so-and-so, I'll always direct them straight to whoever happens to be in charge of that particular project. But yeah, it's an interesting
Yeah.
one.
And it is different from when I worked in government.
Yeah.
You know, there's this great mantra: advisors advise, ministers decide. Ministers do have authority and responsibility for the sign off of um, all sorts of things. And so this funnel of stuff leads completely up to them to say yes or no, and that's quite tricky as well, because if your ministerial instinct is that something is not quite right, but it's been through all that kind of
Yes.
discussion and
Yeah.
audience testing and all the rest of it, that can be pretty tricky. And you know, I remember being a private secretary years ago, and minuting out what was a reasonably kind of throwaway remark from the minister about he'd like to learn more about some aspect of an issue, and then 4 or 5 months later you get a 60-page report which someone has put together researching in immense detail this throwaway remark, by which he sort of
Yeah.
meant, well, that was quite interesting, I'd like at some point, if I bumped into the person who wrote this, to tell me a little bit more about it, not I'd like you to spend a
Days and
considerable amount of
days.
time of expert bandwidth looking into this thing. So yeah,
And that's
this
something we have to teach trustees too, as well, actually, Peter, because that very often, so a trustee will say something, and
yeah
then the members of staff will go away and believe that they got to write a report. And because of the power imbalance, it can be quite difficult to challenge and say, do you, you know, is this a casual throwaway remark, or do you really want to know? And then the
yes.
trustee thinks they've got to make a big deal of it. And, you know, so it's really tricky, this stuff, isn't it? Human beings, life, and navigating our way through it. Actually, I wanted to ask you a question, Peter. I hope you don't mind, because I know, you know, you've officially stood down from NSPCC, but I know you're still passionate about child protection.
And
And it's been all this business about, you know, these big calls for a new public inquiry into child abuse across the UK.
yeah
And I mean, I'll tell you what I think, but I'm really happy to be corrected.
yeah
So my view about it is, we've already had a massive public inquiry, and I don't know how much was spent on it, but millions, as far as I believe, interviewing loads of people, putting the victims of this abuse through this process, having to relive it. That can't be easy to do. And there were a whole load of recommendations that came out of it. And from what I hear on the news, because I don't really know any more than probably most of the rest of the country, none of those recommendations have been implemented since the report was published, which was, I don't know, a year ago, 2 years ago, something like that. None of them have been implemented at all. And so for me, it's like, why would we call for another inquiry when we haven't even taken action on the one that's already been costing so much money? And it was, you know, and I also was thinking about, you were saying about politicians and decisions. You know,
mm,
it also occurred to me, like, so you have choices like another 180 million pounds on on another inquiry versus 180 million pounds to social care, you know, just to implement the
yeah
previous inquiry. So I just want to understand better what the issue is here and what I should be thinking and saying to people.
yeah well, funnily enough, in every one of the leaving speeches that I gave to every audience that was willing to listen, I said, we've had this independent inquiry into child sexual abuse where lots of us, myself included, gave evidence under oath about um, uh, exploitation, criminal exploitation of children in institutional settings. And you're right, it cost £180 million. It took 7 years. It took evidence from over 7,000 victims and survivors of abuse who relived the terrible things that happened to them as a consequence of doing that. And if you read the first few hundred pages of the conclusions of that report, they are incredibly powerful emotionally and intellectually in terms of what those people experienced. And so to troll them effectively by saying, we should find out what's been going on, what these people say and think, is, I think, hugely upsetting and insulting to those people who were brave enough to speak up and speak out. And on a previous episode of this podcast, I talked about the event which we ran back in the autumn, which was purely hearing from 15 people with direct experience of child sexual abuse. And it was really powerful and required an awful lot of support, just to hear from those 15. So my message in each of these speeches was, we've had this inquiry, let's implement it. It reported in 2022. Actually, it was published the day that Liz Truss resigned and kind of sank without trace. And since then, the government has the previous government brought forward a couple of descriptions of how they were implementing these recommendations, the 20 recommendations of the final report. But if you were charitable, you'd say that about 3.5 of them were being implemented or have been implemented. There's so much that could and should be done. So I am 100% with you, and as are, I think, the overwhelming majority of victims and survivors who've spoken up, who said we don't need more talk, we need action. Having said that, but then there are other reports too. So there's clearly a particular interest in grooming gangs of Asian men abusing young women, overwhelmingly white, and that's a particular model of abuse. And the Alexis J. independent inquiry does touch on that. There's a significant section about grooming gangs, and it observes that actually the data is not collected especially well for us to be clear about who the people are that have committed the crimes and who the victims are. But there clearly have been significant prosecutions of Asian grooming gangs, and it's disgraceful and disturbing. But the risk of picking out one model of abuse, which we do need, I believe there could be further research and work done to understand that better, but don't do it if it creates blind spots to other models of abuse. And there are gangs of white males, and there are disproportionate numbers of Black and minoritized ethnic women who are victims of child abuse and neglect. So you've got to be so careful. And Louise Casey did a very powerful report following up Alexis J's original report into Rotherham, which pointed out misplaced political correctness, failure to record ethnicity of victims and offenders for not especially good or convincing reasons. So people who dismiss this as having nothing whatsoever to do with race, I think that is an oversimplification. And people who say this is all a right-wing thing or a left-wing thing, again, that's an oversimplification. We have got to put the victims and survivors of these crimes absolutely front and center, and hear from them and listen and respond to what has happened to them. They deserve no less than that. And thousands of them have done so already in the context of this legally enforceable inquiry where we all gave evidence, say under oath. There's plenty to work on there. So that's where I would start.
So what do you think? Because the media is, as the media does, jumping on the other side of the bandwagon and attacking the government and saying they don't care, etc. What do you think has started this off? I mean, do you think it was Elon Musk's tweets
Yeah.
about Jess Phillips and Keir Starmer, and that people, his disproportionate influence over people's views.
Yes, because the media have done a brilliant job actually at throwing a spotlight on these crimes. 10 years, 10, 11, 12 years ago, really, the media at its best triggered the original Alexis J inquiry into Rotherham, the follow-up by Louise Casey. There are significant numbers of people in prison now and people not in public office as a consequence of journalists doing really good work and helping victims and survivors and those of us who campaign for justice in this space really constructively. So it's ironic and disappointing that some of the same publications rather kind of forgot, I think, the history and the part they played in all of this, and made out that something really new and significant has happened and needed to be done.
Yeah, it's a funny thing, isn't it? It's I'm beginning to think that there ought to be an international law capping the amount of wealth any one individual can have. It's like these billionaires who just prance about thinking they know better than everybody else, and who on the whole are not billionaires because of their own skills, but because of the skills and work of the people who they employ in their companies and their businesses. So I've sort of started to get deeply concerned about that, and it causes so much trouble. And I think poor Jess Phillips, who I'm a massive fan of, but now, and of course, as a woman, like Keir Starmer's getting hate stuff, but he's not getting the rape threats. He's not getting the kind of nasty stuff that Jess is getting. It's just, I don't know, free speech, fine, but slagging people off without facts, not fine.
Yeah. If I was going to list my top 5 politicians who've done the most in this space to shine a spotlight on more needing to be done, Jess Phillips would be up there without a doubt. So that's a very odd and disturbing place to start, and to hear that she's had to have extra police protection
security
as a consequence of this. Again, if we've got a finite amount of law enforcement resource to apply in this space, using it to protect Jess Phillips rather than to prosecute the people who are responsible for these crimes on an evidence-based approach. Terrible. So really disappointing. At the same time, in the same way that stop clock is right twice every 24 hours, Elon Musk was more successful in drawing attention to the independent inquiry on child sexual abuse than I was in any of my leaving speeches, which all sunk without trace. However, interesting, inspiring they were to people who were present at the time.
That's actually a very fair point. Very often these things that look bad do then focus people on other stuff, don't they? Oh, well, the world, Peter, this is, but 2020. So let's think about 2025 coming up now, because what's sort of coming. So what have you, like, since you retired, since you started doing things differently, are you doing anything different in your habits and your ways of living in the world, or are you just sitting around watching telly and eating loads of food?
Well, to be honest, that it's mostly that at the moment. I'm listening to fewer podcasts. I'm not reading a newspaper. I'm probably not as up to date on wider stuff as I might have been. I'm not living in the moment and feeling that I need to be in touch and on top of everything in quite the way I was previously, which I hope will mean that I'm more inclined to listen to other people about what's going on and perhaps show an interest in a wider range of stuff that's going on. But it's early days, and at the moment there's an awful lot of cricket to watch on the television from Australia and from South Africa and from the United Arab Emirates. So there are various Somerset players playing in different places around the country that I feel obliged and required to keep in touch with, wearing my presidential hat, never mind what's happening in the news. So that's that's what I'm up to at the moment.
You were telling me earlier about that you'd read something that Ndidi Okezie, previously UK youth, had written about abandoning her headphones, and you were saying you'd had a
Yes.
different experience. Remind me about that.
Yeah, so indeed, he put a very thoughtful um, piece on LinkedIn about how she'd taken her headphones out and she's going on walks and thinking deep thoughts and coming to terms with herself and her future. She's another one like me who has stepped down from a CEO role and is kind of pondering what to do next. And I'm sure there's lots of fantastic things which she will be
Yeah, she's
contributing, but
amazing.
she's got to get her head around all of that. So she is. She said she was not stuffing her head full of um, podcasts and at one with nature, listening to the birds twittering, and that's the right kind of tweet, isn't it? That's worth hearing. And I thought it was ironic because the thing which I have done in 2025 that's been of most benefit to my health and well-being is taken up couch to 5K again, and I hate exercise and detest running. But if I put my headphones in, there's so much amazing new music to listen to. So I just let Ndidi know that while she is welcome to her silence, I actually need my headphones, and without my headphones, I'm not going to get as fit as I need to be.
That's a good
So
idea. Each to their own. I mean, I'm with Ndidi though. Much prefer silence. I mean, I don't. I like it. If I have to drive somewhere, which I often do to give a speech, and they're often quite
mm,
long drives, might be 3-4 hour drives. I would literally drive in silence the whole way. I won't have the radio on, I won't have music on, nothing like that. I just in silence the whole time. It's just, but there's something about headphones in particular I struggle with because I've got tinnitus. And the headphones, for some reason, really exacerbate it. It's quite annoying most of the time anyway. But when I have headphones in, somehow I need background noise. I need to hear other things to sort of distract from the tinnitus. But no, I'm the same. I love silence. I love sitting quietly in a room where you really there's no noise at all, which surprises most of my team when I tell them that, because they think I must be the sort of person who has to be surrounded by noise and people all the time. But actually, my favorite time is when it's just me, not speaking to anybody, not listening to anything, just sitting quietly, either reading a book or even just sitting in my garden, just staring into space. Because I end up doing things, Peter, like I'll look at the trees and then I'll see, gosh, they're really green. And then I'll start thinking, isn't it amazing about chlorophyll? And isn't it? So then I automatically start thinking about all the science behind what makes trees green. And I'll sit there and thinking, isn't it amazing that that tree is breathing out oxygen at me? And that, I'm breathing it in, So, yeah, so my mind does go off on those sorts of things. But it's funny, isn't it? We're all different, aren't we?
it's become a thing, hasn't it? Raw dogging.
Raw,
Yeah, a
that
lot of
sounds,
young
is
raw.
that something you're allowed to describe on our podcast, Peter? That doesn't sound at all salubrious.
Yeah, no, raw dogging is it took off on uh, social media sometime second half of last year, where
Yeah.
young people now travel. The longer the flight, the better. And you're not allowed to put the headphones in, watch films, listen to. You just have to sit in silence, and it's like modern meditation. So I think I'm being cool, listening to this new music and being like down with the kids. But actually, you're the one who is in tune with modern trends because you are clearly a natural raw dogger.
Can I just say, seriously, I don't know who the hell came up with that phrase, but it really sounds offensive. Please don't ever, ever call me a raw dogger. I've never said that. That's interesting. So younger people are very much into silence and being with their own thoughts. I think that's super healthy, although you have to get a balance, because if I spend too much time with my own thoughts, I tangly mess about life. So I've got to be a little bit careful. Raw dogging, I've never heard of that, and I
Raw
think it's a
dogging.
horrible expression. Why is it called raw dogging? Do you know?
I don't know. I don't know. And I did have to quickly uh, Google it there because I knew it wasn't dogging. because that's something completely different. But I couldn't remember quite what it was called, but it's raw dogging.
Okay.
So that's
I
okay.
shall
We can
remember
talk
that
about raw
phrase.
dogging.
Oh, that's so funny. Well, I think on that sort of, note, Peter, I think we've probably run out of time for this week's podcast. That was great fun. And thanks for, helping me to understand a bit more about the issues around the inquiries and stuff like that, because I think it's important that everybody knows and understands.
Yeah, well, I'd say it's a perspective, but it's certainly a perspective that's born of rather more thought and evidence than Elon Musk's on these topics. So
Well, he doesn't
don't
seem
ask me
prone
about
to thought and
Tesla cars
evidence.
or rockets, because I can't help with that. But
I doubt he can either. He didn't invent the rocket. He paid someone to build him a rocket. Well, what about Tesla? He didn't invent Tesla. He bought Tesla. I'm like, where is this myth coming from that the man's a genius? He's obviously been saying it himself and people are believing it. Anyway, that's enough of that, because I don't want to be the subject of one of his tweets, although I suspect I'm far too unimportant to feature anywhere near anything that he thinks. And I'm very glad about that, Peter. Right.
All right.
Catch you up next week and
Yes.
enjoy the rest of the week and enjoy your day in London tomorrow. And
Thanks
we'll
very
catch up
much.
next week.
Yeah,
All right.
lovely. Thanks a lot.
Bye,
See you.
listeners. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.